it is my particular pleasure to announce our next panel. Since I'm the chair of the Space Generation Advisory Council, I would like to thank Space Foundation for partnering with us to enable us and host the Fusion Forum event earlier this week that happened on Sunday and Monday. Space Foundation and other partners like AIAA, NASA, FAA, and our corporate partners like Lockheed Martin have supported Space Generation to organize the gathering of young professionals and students from all over the world, covering all 5 continents, Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Australia. And in this panel, we will offer you a short brief about the outcomes of the Space Generation Fusion Forum. And to do this, I'm very pleased to announce Ms. Ariane Cornell, our Executive Director. Please come up on stage and do the presentation of this report of our exciting event this year.
Thank you, Catherine. Catherine gave you a brief introduction to the Space Generation Fusion Forum, but I'd like to add a couple more notes. But first, I'd like to start off with what is Space Generation? The Space Generation Advisory Council is an organization that came out of the United Nations in 1999 to represent young professionals and university students in space policy. Now, 13 years later, we have a network of 4,000 members in 100 countries. We work through our projects and our conferences to bring these young people together from around the world, the next generation of space sector leaders, to get their perspectives on the current space topics that are really hot. And that's exactly what we did with the Space Generation Fusion Forum. It has really been a dream of our partners as well as Space Generation to bring an international event for young professionals and university students here to the United States. And that's exactly what the Fusion Forum did. We had 3 panels that covered 3 topics: international collaboration, space applications for developing countries, as well as the new role of commercial in the space sector. We put on some of what I call the SGAC all-stars or rock stars on these panels to get their perspectives. And then these panels were moderated by today's top space sector leaders. We also were addressed by several high-level speakers that were kind enough to spend some of their time with us. Those speakers and moderators included Ms. Lori Garver from NASA, Mark Sarangelo from Sierra Nevada, Mike Simpson from the Secure World Foundation, Yasushi Horikawa of JAXA and the next chairman of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, Clay Mori of Arianespace, Mr. Chumber Farina from the Canadian Space Agency, Enrique Pacheco from the Mexican Space Agency, Melissa Clinton, Senior Vice President of the Aerospace Corporation, and Mr. Bill Parker and Elliot Pullum of our kind host, the Space Foundation. Now, just to give you a brief idea of who attended this event, we limited it to 50 people. We wanted this to be interactive panels. We had the perspectives of young professionals that had some experience, but we wanted to get everybody involved, which is why we limited it to 50 participants. They came from 20 countries. It was 50% American, 50% international, 50% women, and 50% men. Now, those statistics are pretty impressive, especially because they don't necessarily represent today's statistics of the aerospace sector or the space sector, but we really hope that it represents tomorrow's. So, with that brief introduction, we've put together a brief video to give you an idea of what the event was really about. And then what I'd like to do is introduce on stage a couple of representatives from those 3 panels to give you some perspectives of what was discussed on both Sunday and Monday preceding the National Space Symposium. So can we roll the video, please? So on stage, I'd like to introduce, to please join me up here, Ms. Manu Ratnathapapati from South Africa, Diego Urbina, both from Colombia and Italy, as well as Emmanuel David from France. And what I'd like for each of the panelists to do here is to briefly introduce yourself, your background, as well as what was discussed on your particular panel. Maybe give a quick summary. What were some of the, let's say, controversial topics? If there was any sort of contention, we want to hear it, because that's what the event was about, was opening that dialogue for our generation. So Manu, would you like to start?
Thank you, Ariane, and good morning, everyone. My name is Manu Ratnathapapati. I'm a South African citizen currently studying my PhD in Australia. And what I brought to this panel was an emerging nation perspective on key international collaboration topics. So very, very briefly, and it was hard for me to summarize what was discussed in such an interesting panel that we were part of. But the key points that we talked about was the challenges of international collaboration and how we would get around them. So everything from lack of communication to defining mission objectives. We talked about cultural diversity and how that has an effect on international collaborations. We primarily talked about emerging space nations as well, and what their role would be in forthcoming international collaborations. So considering the increasing amount of nations that are working in the space industry, we wanted to look more deeply within emerging space nations to see what their potential could be in establishing collaborations. And I think one of the key points that we focused on was that we need to not only look at cooperation, we need to look at collaboration on a whole. So, thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Minu. And Diego, could you perhaps tell us a little bit about your panel on space applications for developing regions?
Okay, my name is Diego Urbina. I'm an electronics engineer, and I'm a consultant for the European Space Agency in human spaceflight. I was a crew member in the Mars 500 mission, and well, it's been a pleasure to having been in this panel. My particular panel was on emerging nations, and it was very interesting to get a perspective from one person from each nation, even from developed and non-developed nations and emerging nations. The goals that we spotted for emerging nations are basically education, having enough food and having enough health. So anything that can help an emerging nation achieve these objectives is good. And in space, we spotted many applications that can do this. It's a particularly fruitful area. For example, in Africa, we spotted that there's 25 of the world's disease burden is in sub-Saharan Africa, and they only have 3% of the world's health workforce and 1% of the global expenditure. So we need to make this more efficient, obviously, and space can help a lot. There are several initiatives, some from the European Space Agency regarding this, and the aim is to bring education telemedicine to these people, and space can do it very well. Mines is another problem that we spotted. More than 70 countries have landmines underground, and this leads to economical losses and also loss of lives. So satellite applications can help a great deal in this. Another topic that we treated was the motivations of developing and developed countries. Obviously, developed countries aim a lot more at maintaining their establishing a geopolitical power, and also maintaining their space as a backbone of their economical activities, which is very important for developing regions. Well, you have a set of basic needs I already mentioned, but the more you progress in the more resources then you're able to give to this, and the more you get out of this development stage, the more things you can do with space, such as science or perhaps human spaceflight, with in some nations that are already very developed in space among the so-called developing nations like China and India. For the developing nations, well, we realized that possibly the best solution is to have a multinational space agency based probably on the model of ESA, which can help them achieve their goals, which are they have many goals in common in developing nations. So that's something I was spotted. Of course, there are many geopolitical issues that need to be addressed, and that was one of the polemical points in our panel. Some people thought that there's too many trouble. Having a multinational space agency is a lot of trouble. Even having a global agency would be too much trouble. But some of us think that it's hard, but it's worth the hassle, because that's what will help you get stuff done. Finally, we talk about how current space players can help support emerging nations, and we realize that there's not an investment on the long term for space applications in the developing world, so that's a big problem. And also there's a lot of data in public data banks and GEOS and the chart for the natural disasters, but there's no means for the developing nations to crunch this data, to crunch these numbers, to make it meaningful for them. So that's a very important thing.
Excellent. Thank you, Diego. Emmanuel, do you want to tell us a little bit about your panel on the new role of commercial in the space sector?
Hi, good morning. My name is Emmanuel David. I'm a French citizen working for the German Aerospace Center. So I took part of the panel discussion on commercial space flight. We had an amazing panel with people with different background from the US industry, from Europe, and also with a medical expert. We discussed the new approach of commercial spaceflight, which is emerging in the last few years, and the challenges that we are facing right now, and the possible consequences or new endeavors that we'll be facing. So first, we recognize that this new approach is maybe not that new. There is a new way of contracting, a new relationship between the industries and the agencies, especially in the US. But we believe that commercial spaceflight will reach the state maybe in a few years, maybe in 10 or 20 years, as we have right now with the communication industry. Those industries are having new way of organizing themselves with the use of existing technologies, and it's always they need to find always the good combination between risk and the cost effectiveness. In fact, risk is one of the main challenges they're facing. First, risk concerning the market, because currently the market is not sustainable enough for commercial spaceflight, and that's why we need support from governmental agencies or subsidies. But we believe that in the future the market will be there. There was also risk in consideration to safety issues, safety for spaceflight participants, but safety regarding to the systems. That's why there is a need to set up new standards, first on a national level, and then in the second step on the international level. So it's all about getting an equilibrium between safety and cost effectiveness, because the goal of commercial spaceflight is to bring a cheaper access to space. And we should not impair the risk because of the excitement, because we all want to go to space, of course. So what are the consequences of this emerging commercial spaceflight? Is that maybe you and me will be able in the next years to go to space, but what is also very important is that it will allow untraditional spacefaring countries or emerging countries to also have a spaceflight program or a civil spaceflight program, and to use also space technologies to solve the next challenges of our society.
Excellent. Well, so we have time for one or two questions that we have from the audience. Why don't we start with this one, which is, what can emerging nations provide, let's say, developed countries or developed space countries in terms of cooperation? I might start with you, Manu, from South Africa. You have a country that has a relatively strong or emerging space program on the continent. What do you think that South Africa has to contribute?
I think that for established space nations working with emerging space nations such as South Africa, they have a potential to tap into the diversity of emerging space nations and really tap into the potential. There's also partnerships that are going on between China and Latin America, for example, which leads on to not just the space industry, but those partnerships extend further to other industries where resources are exchanged, commodities, things like that. So I think that when you talk about international collaboration, the mutual benefits for any partners is going to be significant.
Okay. I have a question actually for the whole panel on this one. It's more general. So what do you think is the biggest obstacle for young people in their desire to have a career in the space sector? In particular, let's say we'll get an answer from Emmanuel, but also from Diego and Minu, who come from less traditional space countries.
The greatest obstacle, coming from a European country, I'm pretty lucky because I have an established space sector. It's of course the competition because there's a lot of very smart people, but it's also given the budget constraints, we can think that maybe some of the space program are going to be cut, and that means that it's less job, and that would be maybe like one of the biggest obstacle, because we don't have so much visibility. When you're looking for a job, most of the time you can have like for a short term something, but you don't have a visibility on the long term.
Diego?
Yeah. Well, I believe this issue is present both in developing and developed nations. In developed nations, well, it's right now the main obstacle is the economy. The companies are not hiring that much. And it is a big problem. So perhaps people get frustrated, end up doing something else completely different, and that debilitates the space sector in Europe, I believe. In developing countries, well, there's the lack of a space program in all those countries is, well, basically, first of all, when you're a kid, you don't have the inspiration to know, well, okay, I want to do this, and I want to work in space, and even if I don't end up working in space, I will do engineering and I will contribute to my country in some other way. It's just not there. There's not this inspirational factor, and then there is no the industry. So I believe that is the main obstacle. So I think that it's also it's a local problem, but also a global problem, also of the developed region that should plant the seed in these countries, because later on it can be helpful. We just had a panel international cooperation, and the more nations you have available, the more resources you have available, the easier it will be to go to Mars or do these amazing things that we want to do in the future.
Okay. In the interest of time, I might wrap up here, but with a very important part of this panel. When we set out to do the Space Generation Fusion Forum, again, as mentioned, the integral component was bringing international university students and young professionals here to Colorado Springs. And Space Generation worked with our partners to make that happen. We spent $25,000 on scholarships to pass out to, again, what I call our SGAC All-Stars to come join us here in Colorado Springs. And I think that it's important that you get to meet them. So briefly, I'd like to introduce our Deputy Executive Director of the Space Generation Advisory Council to call them up on stage and introduce them quickly one by one.
Yeah, well, good morning or maybe good afternoon to everybody. As Ariane mentioned, I would like to introduce you, all of you, the Global Grant winners. They are coming from 12 different countries. So please, Rahul Joel from India, Laura Trudy from Canada, well, of course, the ones we were on stage, Manu Ratnasabapati, Diego Urbina from Colombia and Italy, Emmanuel David from France, Art Anisimov from Belarus, Heijin Jeon from South Korea, Bekele Erko from Ethiopia, Bustanul Arifin from Indonesia, and Ana Alexandre Perez from Venezuela. And Julia Leeson from Australia. Well, thanks again. We would like to thank our host, Space Foundation, and to all our partners and supporters, because thanks to them, we made this happen. We got these great people. And well, please, let's join me to do another round of applause to all of them, the next generation of international space leaders.
Thank you all for being in this panel and listening to our achievements, which I think are considerable, taking into account that it was the first event in the States that we have pulled together in the last 10 years.